This video was made possible by our supporters on Patreon. If you want to join the community and help us reach our next goal, consider making a pledge. According to Christian Hartmann in his book Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's War in the East, the German invasion of the USSR was a fight for existence between the 20th century's two greatest totalitarian movements, and the conduct of both sides was correspondingly extreme. Both Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union fought the war as though it were a crusade. But only 2 years earlier, these powers had aligned with one another and signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian, and today we're going to be addressing three main questions. First, why did Germany and the Soviet Union sign a pact of non-aggression to begin with? Secondly, why did Germany choose to disregard the agreement and invade in the summer of 1941? And lastly, why did the Soviet Union fail to anticipate and properly respond to Germany's abandonment of the pact? But first, I'm pleased to announce our sponsor for today's video, Virtual Shield. Virtual Shield is a VPN, or Virtual Private Network company, and as today's video pertains to the two major autocratic states of the 20th century, both of which practiced severe censorship and surveillance, we believe that it's very appropriate to address the importance of having a virtual private network to protect your information from cyber attacks, government oversight, or Mark Zuckerberg. Setting up your VPN is extremely simple, and I'm going to quickly show you how it works. First, you'll click my link down below, which grants you 20% off by using the promo code ARMCHAIR. After you sign up and run virtualshieldsetup.exe, all you have to do is click connect and you're protected. You can see a before and after here. First, I'll Google my IP address, then we'll check iplocation.net, and right now it shows my exact location. After turning on Virtual Shield and getting my new IP address, I simply go back to iplocation.net and I can see that all of my information is safe. Whether you're a small business owner or just someone who wants to protect your online data, Virtual Shield is the fastest and best VPN out there for you. On June 22, 1941, a few hours before daybreak, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, is awoken by his head of security, who notifies him that Zhukov, the chief of general staff, is on the phone with important news. It took the heavy-eyed dictator about 3 minutes to answer. And when he did, he found out that the Soviet cities bordering Germany were all being bombed by the German Air Force. An uneasy silence followed. War was on the horizon, and Stalin had made perhaps his biggest blunder yet. Soon after, the Soviet military officials were gathered in the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov, whose signature had sealed the non-aggression pact that bound Germany and the Soviet Union together, was summoned to speak with the German ambassador. He was presented with a formal declaration of war, to which Molotov, stunned, asked, "What have we done to deserve this?" He was well within his rights to ask such a question. After all, the agreement named after him had established a pledge of neutrality for a duration of 10 years, and marked out spheres of influence for both countries in Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Romania. It had ensured that the Germans would continue to receive their much-needed shipments of wheat, oil, copper, and other raw materials, directly leading to the German-Soviet commercial agreement, which allowed Germany to weather the British blockade. Not to mention, the pact had also allowed Germany to gain breathing space in the east, and to assert dominance over the European continent without repeating the events of the First World War. On numerous occasions, Stalin had been confident that this alone would quell any threat of German invasion, proclaiming that Hitler and his generals are not so foolish as to start a two-front war. The Germans broke their neck on this in World War I. Hitler would never risk such a thing. But Stalin was terribly wrong. Since Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s, anti-communist and anti-Slavic sentiments continued to fester in Germany, and Hitler used the communists living in Germany as scapegoats to assert total control over the country, blaming them for the Reichstag fire in 1933, among many other things. Furthermore, the Slavic people living in Germany and Europe as a whole were considered to be Untermensch, or subhuman. Hitler's grandiose vision was to therefore replace the Slavic population in Germany and Russia with German settlers. This idea was called Lebensraum, or living space. To Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a means to an end, and, at least according to prevailing sentiments among historians, he always intended to betray Stalin. However, it was also possible that for a time, Hitler considered the possibility of a world order consisting of Germany, Italy, Japan, as well as the Soviet Union. In November 1940, Hitler had met Molotov in Berlin and laid out a proposal. The British Empire would be gutted and split between the aforementioned countries, which would all respect one another's spheres of influence. In Konstantin Pleshakov's book, called Stalin's Folly, The Tragic First 10 Days of World War II on the Eastern Front, he says that it was at this point that Stalin became confused and overambitious, demanding from Hitler the whole of Finland, Romania, and Bulgaria, and also pieces of Turkey, Hungary, and Iran. What was happening in Europe seemed so extraordinary that every wild scheme was now feasible. Drugged by the orgy of destruction, Stalin thought he could get away with almost anything. Stalin may have also reasoned that Germany and the Soviet Union were in some ways uncannily alike, and that Germany owed the Soviet Union some gratitude. In his book, Christian Hartmann discusses how both countries were former great powers that the First World War had left weak, traumatized, and dismantled. Both had forms of government that were entirely new to them, and both were totally isolated in international politics. It was no coincidence that these two outcasts found their way to each other in the Treaty of Rapallo. The treaty he names arguably paved the way for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It normalized relations between the two countries, led to the renunciation of territorial and financial claims, and gave German troops access to Soviet territory to conduct heavy weapon training that was banned under the Treaty of Versailles. In any case, shortly after Stalin's covetous proposal was issued, Molotov was dismissed from Berlin, and the Soviet embassy never received a formal response. Pleshakov provides a simple explanation as to why, claiming that the demands looked outrageous to Hitler, and the Führer believed he was the only one entitled to megalomania. Regardless of whether Hitler at one point or another genuinely entertained the prospect of a globe shared by Stalin, a viewpoint that is tenuous at best, an invasion of the Soviet Union offered him a unique opportunity. During the Battle of Britain, the British fiercely resisted the Germans and showed no signs of wanting to pursue a peace settlement. Hartmann lays out Hitler's thought process as the Western Front stagnated. What tempted Hitler more and more was the idea of a global blitzkrieg in which each war would nourish the next. If one ever really tackles a colossus like the Soviet Union, Hitler revealed to his military advisors, it breaks apart far more quickly than the world would have guessed. Hitler later conveyed these musings to the German people during a speech in June of 1941, declaiming that you only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. He was as wrong in this assertion as Stalin was with regard to anticipating Germany's next move. This brings us to our final question, which we've already in part addressed. Stalin did not think Hitler would open up a two-front war, but he did not discount the possibility of a German invasion after Britain was neutralized as of 1941. The summer of 1942 was Stalin's estimate, but his estimate was an entire year off. Furthermore, we now know that it was not a defensive war that Stalin was preparing for. He wanted to strike Germany first, pocketing its main force, which he believed was massed in southeastern Europe, engaging it decisively, and then marching through the Balkans toward Berlin. For as distrustful and paranoid a man as Stalin, whose Great Purge resulted in the deaths of 600,000 people, there were many red flags that should have alerted him to the reality that Hitler would be invading sooner. For one, German planes regularly flew into Soviet airspace, which prompted Zhukov and the People's Commissar for Defense, Semyon Timoshenko, to suggest shooting them down. But Stalin quickly brushed them aside, having been assured by the German embassy that the incursions were merely a result of too many young, untrained Luftwaffe pilots getting lost. Conveniently, these pilots were getting lost while flying very low over strategically important Soviet locations. Moreover, the German government received permission from Stalin to locate the graves of German soldiers who had perished during the Great War in Russian territory, again to the disdain of Zhukov and Timoshenko. These grave hunting missions were in actuality intel gathering operations, and they would prove to be very useful to the German military in the coming months. Stalin also received numerous spy reports, as well as a warning from Churchill himself, which may have actually had the opposite of its intended effect, because of Churchill's vehemently anti-communist convictions. When Molotov returned to the conference room to announce the news, saying he was visibly unsettled when relaying the information to Stalin would be an understatement. In the words of Pleshakov, after having heard the declaration of war, Stalin sank lower in his chair. Although he said nothing, no one stepped in. Nobody in the room seemed to know what to do next. Although the Soviet troops on the western border were placed on high alert, the Kremlin sent a confusing and contradictory directive that same night that ordered them to not yield to any provocation. In many locations, German commandos intercepted the order, and in places that it was received, it was met with furrowed brows and head-scratching. Over 600,000 men died during the first 20 days of the war, and the Germans, thanks to Stalin's oversight, pushed on relentlessly. Those first days were the start of the largest land invasion in history. In its wake, 5.5 million Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, and Finns lay dead, along with 8.5 million to 10 million Soviets. When the Germans were finally stopped, it was at great cost, but the Soviets showed the world that the Wehrmacht was not invincible and forced Hitler to divert troops to the Eastern Front, making Germany's western shores susceptible to Allied attack. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Virtual Shield. Many people take their online privacy for granted, and it'd be a shame to pass up such a clear opportunity to protect yourself on the web. Once again, my promo code is ARMCHAIR, and it gets you 20% off of your subscription to Virtual Shield, which already comes with 1 month free as part of a free trial. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank my general staff on Patreon: Derek Bello, Jake Hart, PJ Nave, Alexander Wood, Joe Crispin, Gibbsy, Fritz, Patrick Reardon, John Graham, James Thompson, Jim Talbot, Dimitri Stillerman, and everyone else listed on screen. I'd also like to thank those working on the Armchair History team for making this video possible. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on D-Day.